Hey class, let's jump right in. We are in week 7, part 2. This is lecture 1B, I guess. I labeled it wrong. Sorry about that. Anyway, so let's talk about John Locke. Zip right into this. Okay, all right. As I mentioned before, Locke's whole goal in his philosophical journey, or his attempts to reason about the world, is to seek and discover something more in accord with common sense, in contrast to the obscure and dry speculations of the late scholasticism with which he was familiar. Now, remember that the scholasticism that most moderns were aware of and what we think about nowadays actually was strange and decadent. It became more like a dry logicism that was more concerned with perfect definitions and just weird speculations about things that just didn't matter to everyday life. John Locke didn't want that, and many of the things were just so removed that they speculated about were so removed from our everyday reality that they didn't seem to be concerned about anything that we actually encounter and experience. It ceased to become a philosophy about trying to understand the causes and the relation of the causes in the world, and became again more of a how do we think about things in our minds. That's about all the scholasticism of his time had to offer. This wasn't like the scholasticism of Aquinas and Bonaventure, and I'll even throw Scotus in there just to appease some Franciscans who might be out in the world. But the scholasticism that John Locke was familiar with made him go crazy. It was a scholasticism that had gone sour. No longer did they have the sweet wine of Aquinas, who had converted the water of Greek philosophy into the wine of the gospel, and now they're left with a high scholastic vinegar. You can quote me on that. It was beautiful and poetic, in case you didn't realize it. Makes me wince just thinking about why I'm this way. All right, anyway, so some of his motivation actually came from a conversation that he had with a friend about religion ethics. And in this discussion, he came to the conclusion that for him, I'll just read this quote. So it came to my thoughts that we took the wrong course, and that before we set ourselves upon the inquiries of the nature, it was necessary to examine our own abilities and to see what objects our understanding were suited for, or were not suited or fitted to deal with. And this is in his essays concerning human understanding. It's epistle to the reader, so it's a little letter to the reader. So in other words, before they read it, it's like a preface. He comes to the conclusion that the debates that we know about abstract concepts like faith and morals and so on and so forth are failing to take the first step. So he's saying that we're entering into these debates about faith, about morality, about the existence of God, about the composition of being, but we fail to do the very first thing. And what is it? Well, we need to know how far our minds can actually travel and what medium through which that it's able to travel. Is our mind like a car that's supposed to only drive across dry land, or is it like a boat that can only go through water, or is it an amphibious vehicle which can go over both land and water and go a long distance, but it's very slow, or something along those lines? Now, if our mind isn't suited to some question, then maybe we shouldn't actually pursue it and waste our time. We shouldn't waste our time on questions that we can't answer. So he has a more myopic view of the capacity of human intellect, or at least he thinks that we should be a little more restrained with our ability to just jump right into any discussion whatsoever that happens to pique our curiosity and our ability to plumb out those answers. Now, another motivation for Locke was to be employed as what he called an underlaborer in clearing the ground a little, in removing some of the rubbish of scholastic rationalist philosophy, for the sake of the success of the Newtonian sciences. So basically, he wants a philosophical method that serves the Newtonian sciences, which ultimately eliminates the philosophical concepts and that you find in rationalism and decadent scholasticism, which for him called into question the Newtonian worldview, and that these sorts of positions that you find in late scholasticism, and in rationalism actually hinder and become barriers to the successful progress of modern science. And so for him, the question is, what do we know? Our principal question is whether or not we understand our ideas or things when we start talking about what is it that we know. And this rounds out another debate, or this is a form of it's a question about realism versus idealism. And so with, again, realism, we know things primarily, and with idealism, we know our ideas primarily. Thus the way we phrase that: do we know our ideas or do we know our things, and what shape do our ideas take? And now for Aquinas, like we've talked about before, he believes that we know things first. The first thing that enters the intellect, the ens premium, is, well, ens. It's a being. It's a thing outside of our minds that sort of awakens the active powers of our intellect, and awakens the passive powers of the intellect. Because for Aquinas, whatever stimulates a power is the proper object of that power. And since what stimulates the proper object of our intellect is some sort of experience out in the real world, then it's those experiences of the real world, is the things in the real world that are the proper object and the first thing that we know in our minds. And then after that, we start forming a concept or a phantasm, and so on and so forth. For Locke, he is very careful to define its ideas, which is excellent. And so his definition of an idea is the immediate object of perception, thought, or understanding. We've heard things like this before. It's very Cartesian. And so he's saying an idea is anything that we think or perceive or understand, whether it be a perception with our senses or perception with our intellect. And all these for Locke fall under the category of ideas because they are all just something that we perceive, no matter how we happen to perceive them. Again, like I just said, this is very similar to Descartes, and especially what we see in his meditations. And so all the things that fall under the category of idea for Descartes are basically the exact same thing: sensations, internal thoughts, and experiences, desiring, willing, and basically anything that we are aware of counts as an idea for Locke. And because Locke is an empiricist, he will want to argue two things. He wants to argue that, one, that our ideas are caused by real things in the real world outside of our mind, and two, they resemble our ideas resemble the things in the real world. Now, here's a question for you, and this is something to ponder, and I think this is going to be an issue for the strict empiricist, and it's the same thing that our next philosopher that we're going to be covering in the subsequent lecture with Berkeley is going to raise as well. Can you predict any problems that might come from this sort of definition? If the ideas in our mind are the things that we are aware of, not the real world, but we are only indirectly aware of what's in the real world, insofar as ideas are supposed to represent the real world, what problem might come of that? Again, what's the major issue here? We have our idea, the only thing that we know is our idea about the real world, and it's supposed to represent it. But we never actually ever have any access to the real world itself. Is there a problem that's going to be coming up here? Let's see if you guys can predict it before we get to the end of the lecture here. All right, moving on a little bit. Boom. His critique of innate ideas. So remember, innate ideas are something akin to what Plato would talk about in his various later lectures, where all of us ultimately come, we're born from previously having gazed upon the ideas in the heavenly realm of ideas, and we have this inborn knowledge. But then once we are born to a woman on earth, we have difficulty remembering all of it, and so it's Plato's idea, or Plato's method of the Socratic method, Socrates' method, but Plato mastered it, was almost like a midwife. And so his idea is that we're pregnant with all these concepts. We have all this knowledge about everything in the real world, and the way that you ought to teach is to help deliver it and help draw it out of the person. The knowledge is already there, but now it's just got to draw out of it. Draw the knowledge out of the person. And for the rationalists, all of this, or much of this, was exactly the same as Plato. But it wasn't that we knew everything about the world, but rather there were certain foundational ideas that that we all have innately, without which we wouldn't be able to reason at all, and we're born with it. This would be things such as the law of non-contradiction, or the law of the excluded middle, um, or other foundational first principles of reason. And it's from those first principles that we can build for the rationalists, that we can build a greater system of thought. Um, and as soon as somebody is aware of the definitions contained within that idea, it's known to them, and it's clear to them as a sunny day. They shine by their own light. And now he thinks that these innate ideas are rubbish, to put it lightly, and that in a literal sense, they're garbage. They're trash. That we need to clear these things out because these innate ideas lead to dogmatism, and they will stifle ultimately any improvements we might be able to make in science and within our reasoning. And the reason for that is that if we just come to the table with all these ideas in our minds that we believe are true, regardless of what our experience tells us, then when we encounter something or discover something new in the real world which seems to contradict these previous ideas, like the law of non-contradiction and whatnot, then we will write those discoveries off as nonsense or mistaken, when in reality they could be a genuine insight into the way the world actually works. Because, and again, I think this is just this what Locke is getting at here is a good method. It's something that we ought to strive for. Let me make sure I'm not entirely in the way of the slides here. It's something that we ought to strive for. We should try to keep our biases at bay and be willing to change our mind based on new evidence and based on better reasoning. In fact, we can't be good philosophers unless we do that. One small example for me in the last few years is that when I started here at Holy Apostles, as a grad student, this was 4 years ago now. Yeah, about 4 years ago. I was a hard and fast Aristotelian Thomist, and I thought those Gilsonians and people who follow Joseph Owens and Norris Clark and all that jazz and John Whipple, they were all crazy folks who believed that who believed basically the same thing as like Jean-Paul Sartre um, uh, and would say that we can only know that God exists if we already have revelation or something like that. All of which are mischaracterizations of the existentialist school of Thomism. And now, years later, I actually ended up writing my thesis defending existential Thomism against the attacks of Aristotelian Thomists. Not the more mundane or harmless ones, which are just straw men, like that Gilson doesn't believe that we can know the real distinction without the revelation of Exodus 3:14 or whatever. This is something that you read in a book like from Ralph McInerney, which Ralph McInerney, his book on ethics, Ethica Thomistica, is just golden. Love it. He's funny, he's engaging, he's inspiring, he's a good author. But I think that his books on metaphysics perhaps fall short, especially when he starts writing about Etienne Gilson. He almost loses his mind when he starts criticizing Gilson and the existential Thomists. Something about their existence just, I don't know, seems to make him angry, which is fine. Hey, certain people make me angry too. In any case, it's good for us to be able to change our minds. And if we can't do that, then we're never going to make any progress in philosophy. If you have the exact same position as you did at the beginning of this course as you did at the end of the course, you may not have. You're like a genius and you've already figured out everything you need to say or need to believe, and you've refuted all these positions, or they haven't challenged you or given you any clarity of thought, or I failed to give you the class, or maybe you're not in an appropriate manner, or to put it back on you too, is that you're not paying attention. I mean, these people will no matter how much we may disagree with them, all the modern philosophers will have some truths that they're conveying, and that these truths should form us and shape us and be integrated into our understanding as Thomistic philosophers. Although if you guys aren't Thomistic philosophers, that's fine too. I don't really care. Beyond the fact that I think Thomism is largely true and that you should believe in the truth. But regardless, whenever you study a major philosopher, they should always leave you a little bit different. Anyway, so Locke, away from my little soapbox deal here, Locke thinks that the innate ideas and in holding hard and fast the innate ideas stifles our journey of truth. And they ultimately stand in the way of human improvement. For instance, with his theory of political philosophy, he noticed that a lot of people believe that the divine right of kings is something that's just innate and obvious to people, and if we just hold that to be the clear and obvious truth that is equal to the principle of non-contradiction, so much so that if you deny the divine right of kings, then you're essentially denying reason itself, then we'll never be able to find out whether or not kings are the best rulers. Maybe democracy or representative republic is going to be the best approach to the way that we run our nations, or maybe an oligarchy or whatever it might be. So he thinks that there's some serious problems here. Now, a rationalist, on the other hand, so they think that that whatever is universally held to be true and something that we all believe in must be innate to the human mind, and that we're born with this kind of idea, and that these ideas are essential to us as our humanity is, and so is inseparable to our very nature as rational animality. Now, for example, the first principle of logic that we all universally conceive to be true, or that anybody who's thought about the issue will eventually come to, and you can actually I forget who it is. There are some. I need to take a course on Eastern philosophy or something, because there are some Eastern philosophers who, around the exact same time as Aristotle, actually develop a similar system of logic. It's not as it's not as quite as well ordered as Aristotle's logic, but it comes up with many of the same principles, like the principle of non-contradiction. This maps onto reality pretty darn well. A square can't be a circle. A tree can't be a dog at the same way, at the same time. I mean, this is something that everybody conceives to be rational, or conceives to be true, with respect to how it reflects and maps onto reality, and how we have to think too. So the rationalists then believe that these kind of logical truths are innate, and morality is actually another possible innately held belief, and this is closer to what St. Thomas calls synderesis, which is the general understanding of the moral law that St. Thomas says that each person has. And we know, or we all have a sense as humans, of what the moral law tells us. Now, this doesn't mean like this isn't a person's conscience. This isn't our feelings, at least on the Thomistic perspective. It's not our feelings that drive us towards one thing or another, but rather the Thomists would say that it's what we can discern about the nature of things and understanding nature's relationship to its goodness, that from those two ideas, the nature of a thing and the relation of goodness to nature, which is that of a final cause or final goal, from that we can understand what is good for a particular thing, including humans, and how we ought to conduct our lives. Sure, it's fuzzy and it's difficult, which is one of the reasons why Aristotle and St. Thomas will actually say that ethics is a probabilistic science. It's not exact. But a rationalist, on the other hand, somebody who takes things from a rationalistic perspective, won't give us and the reason why St. Thomas would say this is because that situations and intentions and all that kind of stuff differ. So it's not it's morality is objective. There really is a right way to go about things. But because of our darkened intellect and our weakened wills, it's going to be really tough for us to navigate the moral waters in a way that we would like. But the other way, all humans have a general sense and ability to grasp the final goal of creatures. But for rationalists, it's not about understanding the world, but rather we're inborn with something like the Ten Commandments. We're inborn with this idea that we shouldn't murder each other. We're born with the idea that we shouldn't steal. We're born with the idea that we should respect our parents. And the reason for this is that we find it universal to all people. And so in the way there's a different way of explaining why it is the case that we find the same rational or the same moral systems, or very similar moral systems in around the world. You can actually read C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man at the end of the chapter, or at the end of the book. He lists all these moral exhortations from cultures all times and all places all around the world, and they all essentially come to the same basic conclusions about right and wrong, and give you the same list that's extremely similar to the Ten Commandments for what are the basic aspects of human morality, things like being honorable or courageous, or respecting one's parents and the elders in general, and taking care of others, and all that kind of stuff. And for the rationalists, they believe that it's simply because it's something that's instilled within us. For St. Thomas, it's because we have the capacity as humans to read the natures of things, and understand them in an objective manner. And part of the reason for this is that St. Thomas isn't an anomalous, and a lot of the philosophers in the medieval era, or in the modern era, are nominalists. They don't believe things do really have a universal nature. They believe that things are just particulars. Whereas St. Thomas would say that, yeah, everything that exists is a particular, but they all participate in the same common nature, which is ultimately grounded in God, which is how St. Thomas avoids nominalism. But if you take away the divine ideas and about how creatures reflect God's very nature, you're going to be losing that connection to something that's universal and truly analogous, and that insofar as a perfection subsisting in many truly subsists in one. Whereas goodness in men is something that's accidental, and goodness in God is something that's essential. And so any goodness that we may or may not have, and the kind of goodness that we ought to strive for as humans, participates in the goodness of God in a limited sense. But for the moderns, being nominalists, they don't believe that we have these universal essences, and we're not participating in anything beyond, above and beyond the individual. And so in order for us to have these laws, it's not written in the natures of things. It's not written in our nature to be discovered, but rather it's like a set of commands that we're born with, that all of us come to know at some point. And it's not by examining our natures, but it's by examining the laws themselves. And so those are the sort of moral laws that are present to the human mind according to rationalists. And we have those ideas innately. All right, so how does Locke respond to this kind of stuff? So first, he says that with respect to the first principles, he says that it may be that we know the first principles, and it seems that humans universally understand the first principles because we might have a common experience. And so the conclusion that our common ideas are common because they're innate doesn't quite follow. And so, this is simply because we all have a common experience of the world, and we have similar brain structures and cognitive functions, and so the way that we interpret and incorporate experience into our thinking is going to be pretty similar. He likes to use the idea of fire to have an example of this, or to show an example of how this can relate to something that doesn't pertain to innate ideas like logical ideas. Every human culture that's developed has fire. Fire hot, fire good, because fire cooked meat and other foods not only makes it easier to chew, and so our jaw bones, sorry, this is kind of a weird anthropological thing here, our jaw bones got to be smaller, so there was more room in our brains for growth, and it made it easier for our bodies to digest the food. And because now we can digest the food more quickly, we didn't have to spend as much time chewing food, for one thing, and our body was able to dedicate more resources to different energy systems other than digestion, or other body systems besides digestion. And so we were able to develop these great brains. Yay! But either way, every person, every human society has fire as a concept, and we all know that fire is hot, and that we all know that fire is going to be a good thing in some way, shape, or form. So insofar as we can control it, and you see the fire used as an analogy and a metaphor in various cultures with respect to their, being something that is if somebody's like got a fiery personality, that could be great, but it could be very bad as well, don't you think? Person who has a fire personality is passionate, and if they're if they're using that fire to do something good and to pursue the right and to be virtuous and ethical, then that is going to be wonderful for everyone involved. But if they let that passion get take over, and they're passionate about the wrong things, or they're reactive and they don't control it and guide that passion, then they can be somebody with an explosive temper who is unpredictable, just like fire. And so we have these different ideas about fire beyond even just the physical reality of fire being hot, and giving off light, that you find almost universally throughout human cultures. And so on the rationalist point of view, what this would mean essentially is that, well, the rationalists would have to say that fire is something, and all these different ideas that we associate with fire is something that's innate to human nature. But that doesn't seem to make any sense. It's a reductio ad absurdum argument. And the reason why, and so that he relates this back to the principles of logic. All cultures have a certain experience about the world. And just like how we develop certain ideas about fire, whether it be the idea about fire as hot and giving off light and luminescent and whatnot, we also have ideas about the world that we derive from experience that give us laws of logic. And so it's not so much that we're born with these ideas of fire and being hot and representing, and it could be used metaphorically to speak to ethical positions, or ethical character. But also we have the idea of logic and the principle of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle, and so on and so forth, as something that we derive from our experience of the world rather than something that's inborn in us. He also remarks that not all people know the first principles. Children or mentally deficient people don't know the law of non-contradiction, at least explicitly. My son, if I asked him, Michael, can a thing be and not be in the same way at the same time? He might look at me strange, because that's a confusing sentence, for one thing. Why is it all these laws of logic have to be so oddly worded? But would he be able to know that a square is not a circle? Well, yeah, he does. But if I were to ask him that when he was just learning how to speak or getting an understanding of what different shapes are, I don't know if he'd be able to understand that question. So is it the case that we are able to have those ideas, if that we had those ideas innately? And pre-scientific cultures also don't have these ideas innately. In cultures where they're mostly concerned about making sure that they survive from day to day, or they're still hunter-gatherer societies, they don't have the time to reflect on reality, or the time to think about their ideas, to come up with the conclusion that a thing can't, whenever you have, if A is equal to B and B is equal to C, then A is equal to C. If there are two things that are equal to one thing, if there are two things that are equal to another and one of them is equal to one, then they're going to be, then the first is going to be equal to the third as well. They don't have those sorts of ideas. Now, a rationalist, as I'm sure you guys are already kind of responding, he actually might object to this and say that children, mentally disabled people, or primitive cultures might not know these principles like you find them in a logical textbook. Like I've kind of alluded to this already. Instead, they might know them implicitly, because they know that a square cannot be a circle, or that a bachelor can't be married. But these are just particular instances of the universal knowledge of the principle of non-contradiction, right? So the universal principle at work is in the line of reasoning, even if that person doesn't know that's why they make these sort of judgments. Now, Locke responds to this by saying that we don't really have knowledge if it isn't explicit. So if I am knowledge, if it's going to be knowledge at all, has to be explicit and has to be defined. Now, to say that that we know them potentially is not the same as saying that we know them actually. That would actually be a violation of the law of non-contradiction, because a thing can't be actual in the same way, or it can't be potential in the same way that it's actual. And so if we actually know the law of non-contradiction, then we would know it explicitly. But for Locke, we only potentially know the law of non-contradiction explicitly, and only those things which are known explicitly count as knowledge for him. And so we don't have these. Therefore, we don't have knowledge implicitly, but only through experience. All right. So then, where do ideas come from? I've already alluded to this. All of our knowledge comes from experience. Locke says that when we're born, our minds are blank sheets. There's a lot to write. There's nothing on them, but there's a lot of potential to have something written on them. And all of our ideas are caused by these experiences, which will produce the ideas in us. Now, there's two kinds of experiences that he thinks are important: simple and complex. Now, with simple ideas, he says that we passively receive these ideas from experience, and this is akin to the way that, if you go back and remember, Socrates, I forget which one it is. It's been way too long since I've read the dialogues, but Socrates would talk about how we are like balls of wax, and that whenever we have an experience, or whenever we have some sort of piece of knowledge that's given to us. This is Aristotle. So Aristotle says that we have knowledge imprinted upon us, like a ball of wax. So a form comes, and our passive intellect receives the form. Now, we don't create these simple ideas, but they're caused in us by our senses. Now, what is a simple idea? So these ideas are like the atomic or the smallest bits of our other ideas. Everything that we find in the material world is ultimately, if you break it down, made of matter somehow, and it's made out of atoms or whatever. And so these are the basic units of physical things. And so this is like almost an atomic theory of knowledge, insofar as all of our ideas are composed of the atomic bits of simple ideas, and these are irreducible parts. For example, our ideas have these smallest parts. These are irreducible. They can't be broken down any further. For instance, like yellow can't be broken down any further. Heat, cold, soft. These are experiences of perception, and so and these are things that we find in everyday life, and we can't break down yellow into something else, or even like our own intellectual perception, like thinking, feeling, doubting, or willing. And those parts we can't break down, according to Locke, the idea of thinking into anything smaller, or feeling, or doubting. And now these simple ideas can be combined into bigger ideas, more complex ideas, in the same way atoms can be combined and rearranged into more complex objects. And so when we have a set of complex ideas, or simple ideas, we can put them together to make an idea of like a book, with white pages and a yellow cover with black lettering, that's hard and rough, or whatever it might be. And the same thing goes for people and trees, etc., etc. Complex ideas are actually, these ones are created by the mind, unlike simple ideas, which are impressed upon us. And so the simple, or the intellect does something active here. And when we have these simple ideas, the mind rearranges them into complex ideas, and then puts them together and unites them into something like a book or a tree, or anything really that would be built up of simple ideas that we receive through the senses. And these, again, don't come from experience. Actually, we don't experience things which in themselves are complex, but rather we receive from things simple ideas. And then we reconstitute those simple ideas back into something, maybe back into something, we don't know actually, back into something that would represent a complex idea and a complex being. And so this would be, these are complex wholes. They're different parts united towards one end. This would be like a book, an elephant, a person, a dog, a movie, a tree, water, or a ladder, whatever. And all these different ideas can be broken down into other ideas. So we can break it back down into its base elements until we get to the point where we can't break it down any further. All right, with simple ideas, there's two important kinds of simple ideas. The first are ideas of sensation. And these are immediately caused by sense experience, and it's also going to be against our will. I have this pre-workout energy drink that I have sometimes. It comes in a powder. It's supposed to be fruit punch. And in contrast to some of the other energy drink things I've had before, when I taste it, it doesn't taste like fruit punch. It's more like baking soda. I don't know. It's disgusting. It's not really tasty at all. There's maybe a little bit of fruity flavor to it, but this is the least flavorful uh, baking pre-workout mix I've ever had before. So don't recommend it. I don't even know what it's called, but in any case, moving on. So it's so sensations of ugh, yuck, that's gross, yucky. I don't like that. So I have my feeling of disgust on the tongue is something that is immediately caused by my senses. Or when I told you guys in the first lecture, I think it was the first lecture, I stubbed my toe on some weights, that hurt. Or when I or maybe something pleasure. Why is it everything pain? Because life is pain. I actually tell my son that sometimes he falls down. I'll tell him, life's tough. You got to be tougher, kid. My wife hates it. I'm a bad person, aren't I? Anyway, and it's the same thing with pleasures as well. My wife, for me, got me a huge cheesecake for Father's Day. I love cheesecake. I don't have like a sweet tooth for a lot of things, but I love cheesecake. I also really like cookies and cream stuff, like Oreos. One of my favorite things, my favorite treats is going to Culver's. I don't know if you okay, I think Culver's is a Midwest thing. Anyway, they have these, it's frozen custard instead of frozen ice cream for the dessert. Or frozen, yeah, so it's frozen custard. And then they mix it with junk, just like an Oreo Blizzard or something like that at McDonald's. But the custard is so much more delicious. And I think technically healthier for you than the ice cream. But either way, love cookies and cream stuff. And I like cheesecake, so those are two of my favorite things in the world. Just in case you guys want to buy me a snack sometime in the future. But anyway, so even like pleasurable, those pleasurable sensations would be simple and immediate. And they're supposed to actually represent the world in some way. And so when I taste the frozen custard, it's cold and refreshing, I guess. So there's something cold and refreshing about the thing in the real world. Now, whether or not that thing actually has the secondary quality of cold and refreshing is a question up for dispute. But either way, these simple perceptions are simple impressions are and simple ideas are ones that are immediately known to me. And these simple ideas always depend upon information as it's conveyed to us through the senses and through sense experience. Now, there's another kind. These are the ideas of reflection, and these are secondary to ideas of sensation, because we can't reflect or think about our cognitive operations unless those operations have already been engaged in knowing real things about the real world. But these are still simple ideas, like thinking, doubting, believing, reasoning. So I said before that it would be a simple sense idea from experience to say that the ice cream is refreshing. But actually, that'd be an idea of reflection. I have something cold and it's refreshing, or it's tasty. Those sorts of things would be the ideas of reflections. And so you have the simple ideas, which kind of give us like the brute fact, like fire, hot. Great, fire, hot. But how did fire make Grug feel? Grug feel good. Fire, warm hands, or whatever. The caveman there discovering fire enjoys the fire because it warms him up on a cold day. But the first idea he gets is that fire is warm, not that fire is comforting or something like that. And either way, these simple ideas are given to us through the senses and reflection, and it's always going to be from experience. Now, when it comes to complex ideas, he divides these into three different categories. First, he has compound ideas. Second, he has ideas of relation, and then he has abstract or general universal ideas. Compound ideas combine several ideas to make a bigger and more complex idea. So we take the idea of an apple, which is red and sweet and crunchy and smooth on the surface and everything else, and he puts them all together, and that makes up apple. And so we have like the thing. Now, ideas are, and you can do that for a number of other objects too. A dog is smelly, fluffy, barky, yippy, so on and so forth. It's a dog. Put all those little things, all those simple ideas together, and boom, got a dog. Now he has ideas of relation. These are ideas that we produce by comparing one idea with another and more complex idea. For example, one person's taller. I'm taller than my wife. or that, and so there's a relation. So there's height in both me and my wife, and now you're comparing the relationship between the two, and I am the one who comes out to be taller, but my wife is of course mightier. There's a relationship between husband and wife, and all these two are mutually related, and they're necessarily connected. If you're a husband, then you necessarily have a wife, or if you're a son, you necessarily have a parent. If you're a parent, you necessarily have a child. But either way, you're still comparing two things, and you're comparing two things, and you're coming up with a judgment on top of that, but about the relation. Or you also see the relationship between cause and effect here. You get the idea of me throwing the ball, and my idea of the ball being thrown are the parts of my thinking. I threw the ball. So you have the complex idea I threw the ball, which is made up of more simple ideas, more simple ideas of I throw and the ball is thrown. And putting them together, you got this relationship between here. Now notice here that we're actually comparing the ideas and not things. And so it's our ideas that we're thinking about and putting together here. We're not looking at the way that things are operating in the world. We're just thinking about the way that we think about stuff. And that for him, causality is a complex idea that comes from relating to other ideas. This might be a problem. We'll see. See if you guys can guess why this might be a problem. So now, does the idea of myself throwing and the idea of the ball going through the air give us the same idea as a real person throwing the ball through the air? If all we know are ideas, and if we produce some complex idea like that of cause and effect with just our minds, then do we have any real knowledge of cause and effect in the real world? Maybe not. We'll see. Hume takes this on a little bit later, and then Kant destroys the world by reacting to Hume. But again, we'll talk. There's more to that later. Let's see where I'm at here. There we go. And then finally, we have the ideas that are abstract or general or universal. Now, just briefly here, consider for example, what's common to many individuals. So what's common to all dogs? Well, they are canines. This is totally a nominalistic way of defining the essence, but I'm just doing it for the sake of convenience. They have caninidity, and it's that caninidity of having the kind of teeth that they have, being quadrupeds, having waggy tails, and being very excited about balls being thrown and so on and so forth. They're being predators, having eyes facing forward, floppy little adorable ears, all those sorts of things. So those are all essential to caninidity, and that's what's common to all the things that we call dogs. And whenever we have a general or abstract idea, it actually excludes all the things that are particular individuating. And so what we have resulting from this is more like the idea, like a universal idea or a genre or a species of or even an accident. When you talk about the general idea of redness, it doesn't mean the redness of this little robot's foot, the redness of that book on Aquinas in the Augustinian up there, or the redness of, I don't know, my hair or whatever, which is more orange. I don't know why they call me redhead, because my hair is orange, or that's how universals are accidents, or humanity. Like when you think about humanity, you're thinking about it this abstract way. You're not thinking about any particular human. And so when you think about an idea, whether it be think about a general universal idea, and this is the same truth for same reality for when we think about ideas as Thomas, when we're thinking about species or genus. We don't think about them in terms of like, how does this apply to any one particular person, but how does it relate to all persons whatsoever. And so abstracts away from any individuating matter, any individuating active existence, and so on and so forth. Any, for a rational being, any degree of rationality, how smart a person is, just the fact that they can reason. Okay, moving on. So how does Locke take on primary and secondary qualities? Normally we think about qualities as qualities of material bodies. Now, like, what is it? A few weeks ago, I made burgers outside, and then as I was trying to flip one, and this is the only time I've had beef in lockdown, it's making me sad. Tried to flip one, and it slid right off the grill and onto the ground, and I was just devastated. I dropped my knees, looked up to the heavens, and shouted, "Why?" Yay! Not really. But I was upset because then we had one less burger. But in any case, I thought I cleaned it all up, but turns out I didn't. The meat was stinky. And normally when we think about a quality of a thing, we think about stuff like that. The meat is stinky. But Lot thinks that, or the burger was delicious, or the weights over there are heavy, or my Bob dummy is just like massively immobile. I want to take him out to the garage, but he weighs like 300 pounds, so that's gonna be fun, to try to get him out to the garage. But Locke doesn't think that. He doesn't think that qualities are about the things. He says that or come from things, but they're actually produced by our minds. Now he says that a quality, he defines it as a power in matter to produce ideas in our minds. So there's a power in matter, but it's more about our minds than what's about in the matter itself. So notice again, he relates it to our minds, and and you should also notice that this assumes that real bodies cause our ideas, and so there's this connection between the real things in the world, and the ideas that we have about those real things. We also have to recall that how we define qualities. So we have primary qualities, and these ones are going to be objective, mathematical. They're true for everyone, whether you like it or not, and that a power in a material body to produce these ideas will have to resemble the ideas in the mind that resemble the material of the body. And so what this means is that properties are necessary for Newtonian physics. You have to have them in order to do Newtonian physics. And so since when Locke is thinking about the different qualities, one of the things that he adds to the question, and actually adds to Descartes' definition of primary qualities, which only included extension, shape, motion, rest, and number. So these are mostly quantitative. Locke said that whatever it is out there in the real world, it has to have solidity somehow, and that's something that's clear and certain to my ideas. It's solid. It's something I can move through, and that's one of my clear, distinct ideas about the real world. And his objective here, what he means by that is that the ideas of the primary qualities produced in us really resemble material bodies. My idea of the shape of my computer really does match my computer, or my idea of the ball of motion really are about the ball. And so he thinks that we have this connection. We have the ball produces the idea in our minds, and then the idea in our minds really does represent the ball. So quality, whatever it might be, is actually a power of the mind which produces an idea in the mind that resembles the world. But it's because that the material thing in the real world has a power to cause that to happen in the mind. And that's for primary qualities. Secondary qualities, on the other hand, are a power in a material body to produce ideas in the mind that do not resemble the material body. So these are, like we've already talked about, they're subjective in what we normally mean by quality. Colors, sounds, taste, odors, warmth, coldness, heaviness, so on and so forth. Tiresome, refreshing, other adjectives. And these are subjective. And it's because ideas of primary qualities don't resemble material bodies, and we know this because they vary from observer to observer. Then we can say that again, that they don't reflect real bodies. Now, if you've ever gone on a fast from sweets, like a really long one, and I mean like nothing, you're going on a sugar crash diet basically, and you get no sugar whatsoever. You'll start to notice that, and this is really interesting, that fruits and other natural sugars, like even the ones you find in vegetables, are a lot more satisfying and sweet than when you're eating like a cheesecake on a daily basis, or eating 5 or 6 pieces of chocolate or whatever. Yeah, so your experiences of these things are going to be different from person to person. Somebody who's eating really healthy and never eating candy is going to be much more satisfied by a mandarin orange than somebody who is constantly downing a thing of Cocoa Pebbles every 15 minutes, and which would be weird, I guess, and like eating cookies for dinner, and that's basically all they have. The sweetness of fruits and vegetables is going to be the same. And so the secondary qualities are not something that are objective about the real world, but rather they're simply something that is a a reflection or a response to an aspect that comes from the primary qualities, and that depends on the receptivity of the subject. And so somebody who's desensitized to sweets or desensitized to caffeine will experience the stimulation from sweets or caffeine in a way that's different to somebody who is not desensitized to it. Okay, let's move on to his talk about knowledge. So, Sean Connery is now going to be your lecturer. Why am I like this? Anyway, let's talk about Locke's view of knowledge in general. And he has 3 degrees of knowledge. These are intuitive, demonstrative, and, of course, sensitive knowledge. So, beginning with intuitive knowledge, these are truths known immediately without proof. And this is what would produce, like, absolute certitude. And they don't require any proof, and they shine by their own light, like we talked about before. So, example, the first principles of reason, like the law of non-contradiction, the principle of excluded middle, or the definition of a triangle. And again, these are the same things that Descartes would say we know indubitably once you understand the terms. Now, interestingly, just like Descartes, Locke does say we can have certitude about our knowledge of our own experience, but he also makes a similar argument to Descartes' cogito argument, not cognito argument. What is with that? Did I say that? No, I didn't get that. It says cogito. Auto-corrected on my notes to say cognito. We can have knowledge of our own secrecy. Only your mind is known to you, which is actually true. Anyway. So, demonstrative knowledge. So, this is truth that is known immediately through a chain of deductive reasoning. And so this would be something like the Socrates syllogism here. All men are mortal. Socrates is man. Therefore, Socrates is immortal. Or everything which... I'm going to use the Kalam cosmological argument. Forgive me. Everything that begins to exist is caused to exist. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe is a cause for its existence. These are things that we know through the use of a middle term. And this does give us some certitude, but it's weaker because in deductive reasoning, because just like Descartes said, it depends on memory. For example, like a mathematical proof, or the 2 arguments I just gave you. And now where he differs from Descartes on this is that he thinks our ideas aren't intuitive, but actually come from experience. And so we discover the relationship between cause and effect, and so we'd be able to throw that into an argument like the Kalam cosmological argument, or Locke's later argument for God's existence, which I think we cover in the next lecture, or next week. But they're known through a middle term. They're known immediately, rather than immediately. Finally, when it comes to sensitive knowledge, this is kind of knowledge that comes through, sense experience, as I'm sure the name of it indicates. So, like Descartes, Locke thinks that we only know with sense experience, and these are things that are only known probably, but not with any certitude. But he doesn't think that we need to build a complex web of proofs to show that we can actually trust the senses. Instead, he just says that it's all right, we can go with this. Because it's true that we only know the world with a certain degree of probability, and it's high enough to do science, and that it's also high enough to do philosophy and live our daily affairs. And so we don't really need to prove it first. Instead, we just accept the fact of reality and the reality of sense experiences in order to get on with anything. And without doing that, you're more or less going to be spinning your wheels. You're not going to be able to move forward because you won't have any ideas. You won't have the ability to reason about anything. And that this knowledge about the material world is where we have to begin our ideas, and from it we can derive the rest of our philosophical system and about our ideas about the world and try to understand the way the world works. Okay, that's enough of his epistemology. Let's jump into his metaphysics. And for many people, metaphysics is a secondary science, actually, to epistemology. Whereas for St. Thomas, epistemology is sort of a subset of metaphysics, but it's what some Thomists have called the defensive part of metaphysics, basically meaning that we're demonstrating the principles of metaphysics, or we're defending them against objections from skeptics. Anyway, so in Thomistic and in Aristotelian metaphysics, typically metaphysics is primarily concerned about substances, only because it's in substances that we find the most how do I say this? It's in substances in the real world, the beings of the real world, that we find reality, or that we find real being. we find being in accidents too, but accidents don't have their own existence on their own existence, their own active existence, strictly speaking. They're not independent from their substances. They're distinct from their substances, but not like a real strong distinction. It's like a weak distinction because they're really different powers within the substance, or different aspects of the substance, and they're not essential to the substance, but the accidents depend upon the substance. And so whenever we talk about metaphysics, we're usually going to be talking about substances, and for the Thomists, it's really about things which exist. And so we can as a Thomist, actually do metaphysics by studying the in-essay or the essay of accident and referring back to the substance. But either way, we're going to be coming back around to substance. It's just that as Thomists, we look at things in metaphysics according to their active existence, as the primary act to understand them by. Anyway, so Locke does the same thing essentially here. Locke, in a lot of ways, relates or connects to Aristotelians and Thomists quite a bit. And so when he talks about metaphysics, he's talking about like individual things: a rock, a tree, me, you, all these different concretes that exist, and at least with like some relative independence. In contrast, again, to the accidents which always have to inhere in a substance. Now, for Locke, he thinks of substance this way. Remember, for Thomas, a substance is that which has an essence to which it does not it belongs to not be in another, and so it's something that exists independently on its own. At least not as insofar as it's a part of something else. So substance, and I think the Latin here is useful. It means to stand under. So substance. So what stands under? Well, what stands what? Under what? Well, the qualities that are perceived in the thing. It's redness, it's roundness, it's sweetness, and all the other qualities that we usually associate with an apple. We take all of these simple ideas and combine them into something whole. Now, Locke argues that qualities like redness, sweetness, and so on need something, into which they can adhere. Like, it's like the analogy is usually like a pincushion. So there's a pincushion that exists, or there's a pincushion underneath all these different qualities that we perceive, and that all the different qualities that we perceive are just pins that somebody poked into it. And so the idea is that there's something that is behind the qualities which unites them, and this is what we call the substance. So the pincushion is a substance, and the pins are the various accidents that we see. And so, according to Locke, what is a substance? Well, he calls it I know not what. It's a thing I don't know. I don't know what the substance is. I know it's got to be there, but I can't tell you anything about it. And it's not so much that it has qualities on its own, but it unites all the qualities together. And if we took if we took away all the qualities of a dog or an apple, what's left? No idea. Which is why Locke doesn't really know what a substance is. He just knows that it unites the qualities. And so Locke's view of substance is usually called a bare particular, and it's because it's this thing. If you just consider it precisely in itself and abstract away all the essences, we know it's a thing that's there, but it's naked. It's bare. Now, how could this be problematic for an empiricist? Well, remember that an empiricist says that we can only know what we have in sense experience. But since sense experience only tells us about something hiding beyond the qualities that we experience, that's all we get. We have an idea of the qualities, but we don't have any empirical experience of the substance behind those qualities. So Locke is a bit inconsistent with his empiricism here. He says that we know that a substance exists there, but he's only reasoning to it. He's never, on his own account, he's never experienced the substance. Or at least that's what seems to be the case. Whereas, Thomist, we could say that we do. That's actually the thing that we do experience is the substance, and that we experience the substance through its effects, which are the accidents, the proper accidents to it. And so we experience the substantiality of the apple by seeing its redness and tasting its crunchiness, or feeling its crunchiness and tasting its sweetness. But for Locke, he says we don't even do that. We can't experience substance. We only experience these accidental properties of a substance. Now, what about his understanding of essence? So, a real essence is generally considered a thing's nature. And so, what is the essence of a man, a dog, a triangle, a tree, whatever? And it's the nature of form that makes an object the kind of thing that it is. Now, for mathematical sciences in the modern era, whose world is nothing but a bunch of atomic particles, the essence would simply be the various ways in which the atomic particles are rearranged or arranged. For example, I am a human because my atoms are arranged in a human way. And there's nothing more to my nature other than the arrangement of my atoms. But the empiricist doesn't have access to the structure of atoms, and so we can't know that this what the arrangement is, or rather, we can't know the arrangement itself. And so this would mean that we don't actually know what the essences are. So since we don't experience the arrangement itself, but only the atoms which are arranged, we don't know the real essence. Because the definition of an essence in the modern mind is the arrangement of atoms. So we get what? We get a nominal essence, and these are just ideas that represent common qualities that we experience in the material bodies of the world. So we experience many beings that are both rational and animal, and I abstract beyond these individuals and find the common trait that makes them similar, and we call it rationality or animality. And the same goes for all universals. These aren't the real essences, that's the atomic structure. But our definitions then of these things are ultimately going to be nominal. So my definition of a man as a rational animal isn't essentially, it's a nominal definition. It's something, it's a name I'm giving them. Now here's a problem to this approach. It's entirely subjective. It's possible for us to rebuild a fence with different boundaries. And if I did that, then there would be a different nominal definition because there'd be different commonalities. And so we could group, for instance, a group of brute animals and rational animals in one instance, and say that they're different, but then to say that brute animals and rational animals aren't the same, but then lump humans, dogs, monkeys, birds, and whatever else together as, or not birds, but lump them as mammals and say that their essence is manimality. Almost sounds like manimality. I don't know. Either way, we could identify and define things however we want to based on whatever idea we want to focus on. And is insofar as it's clear and distinct and it's and it works, it's fine. And so we don't really have a way of talking about essences beyond some sort of nominal definition we might give them. Okay. So that's it for Locke. Next, we're going to be talking about Berkeley's response to Locke, but also a Thomist rebuttal. Wow, I can't believe that. Thomist rebuttal to both of these thinkers. All right, thank you guys. God bless. Next one should be shorter.